In this segment of our discussion on income distribution and inequality, let's take a look at some current and future issues. I'd like to go ahead and talk briefly about an article written by a professor of economics at Brigham Young University by the name of Clayne Pope, an article he wrote in 2009 talking about income distribution and inequality, suggesting that income inequality may not be as difficult or as pronounced as it appears. I'll admit to you that I've had a number of conversations with Professor Pope over the last several years. When I first saw his article, read the abstract or kind of the introduction to it, I thought, well, here's a BYU economist, probably very politically, socially conservative. Maybe this is just some kind of rationalization as to why income inequality is not that bad. And then I read the article with a little bit of a bias going into it, but what I found was an extraordinarily objective treatise written by one with a very balanced handling of social and political issues. And I became introduced through this paper to an individual for whom I've gained great respect over the years, as I've had numerous conversations with him and have written virtually everything I could find that he's written, or as I've read virtually everything I could find that he's written. What Professor Pope is suggesting is that, yes, if you look simply at nominal income values or even real inflation-adjusted income values, inequality has dramatically increased since 1980, without question. But maybe we need to look a little bit beyond the surface here. Think about what has happened to prices of those consumer goods that are purchased most often by lower income households. Have they remained constant in their prices? Have they gone up in price? Have they gone down in price? He would argue that they have actually decreased in price. And I would hold as evidence of that the Walmart effect, the Costco effect, where the per unit price of so many goods within our society, certainly those commodity goods used most heavily by lower income households, have done nothing but decline in per unit pricing, per unit real pricing over these years. Yes, I might have to pay $10.99 to get a bottle of spaghetti sauce at Costco, but it's a bottle that's going to last my household 4 weeks because I think it's about 1.5 gallons. And that's an overstatement, of course, but you get it. Or if I'm buying some mayonnaise or eggs or milk, I'm not buying a quart of milk or a half a dozen eggs. I'm buying 5 dozen eggs. I'm buying 2 gallons of milk at a time. And admittedly, these may only work well for households that have a sufficient scale to use those perishable commodities in that time frame, but we do see that prices have gone down. Think about electronics, for heaven's sakes. Clayne Pope goes ahead and discusses this technological innovation such that I can buy a 65-inch flat panel television with extraordinary clarity and great internet connectivity and extraordinary utility today, and I probably pay less for it than I might have paid for a 32-inch color television in one of these great big black boxes that had low resolution, didn't connect to anything, and was as deep nearly as it was wide, and took a tremendous amount of space in a box or near a wall or on a TV stand or something. And we pay roughly the same price, suggesting that television sets have remained relatively constant in value, maybe have gone up a little bit, but what we're getting for that is so much more. Similar to the computer. I purchased my first computer in my household in 1986. It was relatively expensive. It was $7,000 for the computer and the printer and the monitor. I was almost certainly one of the first households in my neighborhood to have a computer. I certainly had the first computer in my office for any financial advisor in my region of the country at the time or of our company. Well, today, that same setup might cost me, if I got something really nice, maybe $2,500. And that's if I went to a relatively expensive brand. So the price has gone down from $7,000 to $2,500, but that doesn't really tell the story. Pope would argue that the story really is told in what I purchased in 2000, or excuse me, in 1986 for $7,000. Was something that had a 20 megabyte hard drive, and we thought, oh my gosh, how wasteful, how could you ever accumulate 20 megabytes of data. Well, today we put 20 megabytes in our pockets over and over and over and over again, and they're so inexpensive, they're almost free for us. We lose these little flash drives that are 20 and 30 and 60 and 80 gigabytes. So we have so much more processing horsepower and so much more clarity and detail, but we're paying a lower price. Similarly, the price of travel and transportation, the price of other social goods and such has just shrunk, as well as we are a healthier population than we were 30 and 40 years ago. Oh, admittedly not as healthy as we need to be, and in some metrics, some parts of the population have suffered, but overall, we are a healthier population. Overall, we are a population that lives longer. And we have so many of these improvements that when you think about the utility that they create and you make adjustments against this unequal distribution of income for some improvements, utility-enhancing improvements within our society, Pope has argued fairly effectively that income inequality or inequality in general isn't as negative as it appears to be. That said, he does not undermine the fact that it is worsening and that it is difficult and it is even tragic. If we think about income inequality between developed and developing economies, as well as between developed economies, it's really rather interesting. I showed you the graphic with the OECD in the prior segment, showing you the United States is the most unequal in terms of dollar terms or currency value terms of any of the polities within the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. But what we see is that this change in inequality amongst the OECD nations, where the United States has not always been at the bottom, or adversely at the top, if you will, this change is roughly a change of taxation. It's roughly a change of globalization, and it's roughly a change where we see that that it is the upper end of our income spectrum has gotten well beyond the bottom end of the income spectrum. So amongst the developed nations, we see changes in income inequality. Think about the United States. Think 30, 40, 60 years ago. The United States was clearly seen as the land of, the country of opportunity. Immigrants flocked here, not in droves, but by the millions, certainly in the earlier parts of the 20th century. But even still, we have millions of immigrants each year coming to the United States looking for opportunity, but the opportunity doesn't exist as it did once. The opportunity was great mobility between income classes. If we looked at a graphic that would show us this, we would see that just as the United States is amongst the least equal distribution country, at least equal distributions for nations throughout the world, we have some of the worst income mobility as well. It's not that one can't go from poverty to wealth in our country. Clearly one can. It has just become less and less likely for that to happen as we compare ourselves with other countries within the OECD. We find that part of the motivation for this has been globalization. As we have become more and more globalized, we find that our lower income part of the population has taken the brunt of this. Yes, they've enjoyed lower prices on commodities and consumer goods through Walmart and Costco and such, and we have enjoyed a greater utility because of some of these improvements. We find that income gains amongst the lower parts of the income spectrum have been non-existent. In fact, in some cases, even declining, as we talked about this a little bit as we talked about globalization. And it's only within the upper parts of the income spectrum that we've seen significant gains. And this is a function of globalization as we've moved so many of our manufacturing jobs, our middle class, decent income jobs to other political environments. But most of those investors, the lion's share of investors in the Western world or the wealthy world, are U.S. investors. So we have opportunities to benefit not just within our own country from low wages and high price of goods sold, but we can benefit from low wages throughout the entire global economy, and we can sell our products throughout the entire global economy. We're not the only nation, of course, by any means. We have some extraordinary manufacturing powerhouses in Asia, such as China and in India. But at the end of the day, the United States is not the land of opportunity that we once were. We have the lowest capital mobility and the highest inequality of any country within the OECD. We also have to consider something for a moment as we think about capitalism, and there is a paradox. There's actually a set of paradoxes, if you will, or paradoxi perhaps, of capitalism. And the first we've talked about earlier, and that is capitalism relies on free and competitive markets. So we think about free and competitive markets with lots of competitors. We then realize that those free market conditions give rise to the zero profit condition, which means there's little to no accumulation or surplus to accumulate. And capitalism is the accumulation of surplus. Well, if we have little or no surplus to accumulate, we don't have a very vibrant or thriving capitalist economy. So it's a bit of a paradox. We rely on that free market competition, which would result in zero profits, but we also rely on the accumulation of surplus, which comes from anything but a competitive market environment. It comes from anything but zero profits. So that's one of the paradoxes, if you will. The second part of the paradox is that the accumulation of surplus, which again is the very foundation of capitalism, results in the ownership of production being concentrated in the hands of few. Because if we are constantly accumulating that surplus, then that means it is being concentrated amongst fewer and fewer and fewer, because it is a zero-sum game in this respect. It is a game in which one person's accumulation of it comes at the price of another person either losing some of it or becoming stagnant in their accumulated resource. So it becomes concentrated more and more in the hands of very few oligarchic units. Excuse me. And we ultimately are conceptually able to arrive at a point where there are so few oligarchic units that hold this tremendous amount of surplus and accumulation, and everyone else, the 90 or 99% or 99.99% or whatever it happens to be, ends up with so little income that it can't afford to buy the goods and services that it produces as it works for these oligarchic units, which then significantly dampens the income capacity or the accumulation or surplus accumulation capacity of those units. So too much income inequality then creates a problem of not enough of decreasing profits that can't be accumulated. We actually see this trend taking place. We have seen that as we have had an increase in income inequality, we have a decrease in the rate of profit, and it's because of this very effect. So we have these two different paradoxes, if you will, of capitalism. One of them very, very poignantly focused towards income inequality. Finally, then, we have to think about this issue of inequality and unrest. I represented with some graphics some of the income gap. Let me give it to you again briefly in a form that can help us see some of this inflection point, unrest, and turnings and such. If we're looking here on the y-axis at percentages of total income, and if we look now at our x-axis at time, so moving through time, here let's say that we're even looking maybe back at 1800, and here we're all the way out at 2015. And if we think about in our blue line, we think about the top 10%. We would see that the income of the top 10% started out as a very high portion of overall income, and during these years moved downward. And and clearly it's not an even movement. It's not even the movement I've shown exactly. I'm just trying to give you something representative that is not always even. It's not always smooth, but it is somewhat monotonic in that it's continuing this trend line moving downward. But that we get to a point at about 1980. 1978, 1980, 1982, where we then see a change, an inflection point, and we then see beyond that, we see this kind of upward trend. Once again, it's not smooth, it's not even, but it is relatively monotonic for this top 10%. Contrast that then with and I'll say the bottom 40%. And this could just as easily be the bottom 20%. It could be the bottom 50%, where we see that bottom 40% of the population or the households, then during these years went from having a relatively small portion of overall income to a relatively continual increase. And we see this continual increase, and it's relatively smooth here. If that was a knife, we wouldn't want it on our skin. It'd be rather jagged, of course, but it's a relatively smooth increase because it's the bottom 40%. It tends to smooth out when you include more and more of the population. But we see that it's a very definite upward trend line. We see that here we have the increasing intensity of unionization within our country. We see here that we have productivity increases being relatively evenly split between the profit share and the wage share, such that median and average per capita incomes were going up during these years. But as we get to 1980, we then see this divergence, if you will, such that this line is now headed backwards, is now going south. And so we saw that the income gap was very wide, and it became narrow. And it has become rather wide again by 2015. Well, what's it look like as we go beyond 2015? Do we get to a point where we see this trend line reverse itself, and this trend line reverse itself, and are they smooth, are they jagged? What does this look like? Well, we don't know. Part of the reason that we don't know is we can't see when it happens. When the U.S. economy and other economies were relatively tightly encapsulated, where what they produced domestically, they sold domestically, and there was relatively insignificant amounts of export and import, certainly compared to today's exportation and importation values, we saw that a nation could control its own policy space. We saw that that if a nation reached these levels where some unrest was being fomented, that we had these inflection points and we saw changes. But why do we not see that today? I mean, income inequality has become significant. Why do we not see that today? And the answer probably comes in the guise of globalization once again. Let's suppose for a moment that I'm a wealthy industrialist in the United States. Maybe I'm even an oligarch. I've got my private island and I've got my private jets and I'm phenomenally wealthy. Well, Piketty would remind us that, yes, while that oligarch, I might have fewer opportunities to create profit or accumulation or surplus from domestic activities because maybe there aren't enough people with enough wealth or income in my own nation to buy enough goods and services from me that I continue to prosper. I can go outside of my nation now and I can sell to the rest of the world. And yes, the rest of the world may not have the wealth the United States has, but here we have China with a middle class that is larger than the entire population of the United States, 400 million people in their middle class, and another 800 million people, yes, in poverty, but whose median income or average incomes are increasing. Both median and average incomes are increasing there, such there's a tremendous opportunity to sell my goods and services maybe to a small part of 1.2 or 1.4 billion people, but a small part of 1.4 billion is a big number. We have India coming up behind them. We have the rest of Southeast Asia. We have South America. We have Africa increasing in development, increasing in median incomes as we have stagnated or as we have increased in our income inequalities. So we have this whole issue of globalization. Yes, we may be nearing an inflection point. Is it this month, or is it this year? Is it this decade? It is so difficult to tell, but at some point, we get to a point where this gap becomes so broad, so wide, that the economy can no longer progress, and where an inflection point must take place. That probably is accompanied by some social unrest. So think about this. This is the last segment that we have in the last module for our course. Income inequality is a very illustrative tool and a very rich storytelling apparatus that we can fit this whole question of why do different workers receive different wages. We can think of elasticities. We can think of skill differentiation. We can think of human capital. We can think of compensating wage differentials, and we can think of profit. We can think of discrimination and profit maximization and monopsony and utility maximization. We can talk about all of these things, and we can do so from within this storytelling structure of income inequality. And it's not just a storytelling apparatus. It is a story that has been built within this apparatus. It's a story that we can tell, that we can then think about all of these questions as to why different workers receive different wages. I hope that through this course and through these various modules, you've been able to see why I am so enthralled with the concept of labor economics. Of all of the various courses I've taught at this university and the other at which I teach, this is my favorite course. And I hope that through this online mechanism, I've been able to deliver some of that passion to you. I hope I've been able to deliver enough of the dynamics and enough of the relevance of those dynamics to you and your life and our role within our economy that it's become interesting to you as well.